And this is one of the parts of your book that I just that has just resonated with me so much. I mean, we particularly obviously around MLK Day, we see essays saying that Martin Luther King's message has been co-opted in many respects, and he was a social democrat. We're seeing that a lot now. Obviously, I think partly because of the presidential primary, but we do hear that. But this idea that in which is one where much of what the sort of the misremembering, as you call it, of Martin Luther King has been part of this project to shroud that difference between, and I really want people to understand this concept of having certain ideals, and we're human, and so we never achieve those ideals. And that being part of, sort of MLK pushing for us to be as good as we can be, as opposed to the idea of like, even that shadow or those aspirations, inherently in those aspirations, something's amiss, that there's something structurally problematic built into those aspirations that we're not recognizing.
Right. I think it's really important for us to grapple with this, right? And that is this kind of American exceptionalism is the built-in protection we have against honestly confronting, right, the evils that have defined our history and continue to define our present. And they're evils, right? And what I mean by that is this, right? It's one thing to say that there's a gap between our ideals and practices, and this is at the heart of the classic sociological text around race, and that's Gunnar Myrdal's The American Dilemma, right? And so he says that's all we need to do is align our practices with our creed. There's nothing wrong with the creed. But what I keep asking myself is, this is a odd sense of a concept or idea of what it means to be an agent in the world if you constantly have these ideas, but the practices over time suggest that those ideals actually don't obtain. Right, so the way in which we judge whether or not those ideals are animating our life, right, is to see exactly what we're doing. And when you look at American history, what we have been doing is more consistent with the value gap than it is consistent with any robust notion of democracy. So part of what I've been trying to argue, and what I'm arguing in the book, is that if we believe that we're the Redeemer Nation, that we're the shining city on the hill, that we're always already on the road to a more perfect union, we make it possible for us to be Democrats and racist at the same time. We make it possible for folk to, and this is what's really odd, right? You ask, in the social science data, Sam, you ask people if they're committed to racial equality in the United States, and they say yes. But then when you ask them about particular policies that would bring about racial equality, they are vehemently against it, vehemently against them, right? So we have produced a circumstance, we have produced a set of conditions where people can say they believe one thing, but in their actual doing, they're doing exactly the opposite. So what we have to do is to say America is not unique in its virtue, nor is it unique in its vice. Or to put it in a more positive way, America is neither unique in its vice, nor is it unique in its virtue. Right? And once we make that claim explicit, then we can go about doing the hard work, right, of really imagining what a genuine multiracial democracy will look like, what it might look like on the ground, right? And that involves beginning by closing the value gap, uprooting those racial habits, addressing white fear. And that's going to require us to not disremember our past or misremember our past, but to confront it honestly, right? To look that ugliness squarely in the face. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, when you talk about the sort of that disconnect between the studies that show, people want to fight racial inequality, but don't want to actually implement the policies that would bring about that inequality. I mean, it's just, we had guys who wrote all men are created equal and they own some slaves. I mean, it's when you really sort of confront that notion, there's only really two answers. One is they didn't realize they owned slaves. I mean, it's not enough to say that they, in my mind, that they didn't realize that these slaves were actually men or human in the way that they perceive themselves. But the answer is in some way that we've imposed something on those words that weren't really there. And it's one thing to simply say, we're going to reinterpret those words and then say they did not measure up to their own ideals. But these guys would have to be pretty stupid to have been able to write that and not realize that they were enslaving people. Like there is something fundamentally embedded in that dynamic that we don't really spend much time talking about and contemplating, like, how is it that they wrote those, but knew that the guy who, walked in and gave them the pen to write it was their slave.
Right.
It's
like when John Adams, according to David Roediger in his book, The Wages of Whiteness, he quotes this passage of John Adams saying to King George, "We will not be your Negroes."
Right.
So at the very moment in which he's giving voice to an idea of freedom, it is based on a very intimate understanding of what unfreedom is. You see? And this is the schizophrenia. This is at the heart of the American Democratic Project. This is what distorts democracy in this country, right? So at every moment of advance where we expand the notion of democracy, right, an idea of whiteness, right, this idea of white people being valued more than others is reasserted to limit how that expansive notion, to contract it, to bring us back to a notion of the status quo. And so part of what we have to do is to kind of step out of this idea that America is God's gift to the world and begin to look that darkness squarely in the face. This is what Jimmy Baldwin was asking us to do. Right. This is what Fannie Lou Hamer, you heard in Fannie Lou Hamer's voice when she said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Right. This is part of what democracy in black has always been. I say to folks all over the country, what democracy in black is the effort and actions of black people along with others to make real the idea that this is a country of the people, for the people, and by the people, by expanding the very notion of what we mean by the people. Which means what? That we reject that America is a white nation in the vein of old Europe. And we do so by putting our bodies on the line, by making people uncomfortable, by challenging white supremacy at its core, and doing so in the name of justice. Doing so in the name of justice, which means, in effect, doing so in the name of standing in right relation with our fellows. In right intimate relation with our fellows, Sam. And that's a radical politics, right? That's a politics that will say, after the Oxfam report, that 62 people owning more than 3.5 billion people,
right?
That's evil. That's evil, right? And to have an economic philosophy that produces that kind of inequality, right, is evil. And to have a world organized and have a country organized along the principles of democracy that believe that there are certain people who are disposable, right, that's evil. And in the best of our tradition, that's what we do. But that second part in the book, I kind of get critical of the black political class because they become so complicit in the world as it is.
I want to get. I mean, there's so much here to dig into, I want to bounce this off you because, there is some measure of hope in your book, but I appreciate the fact that it doesn't. Your eyes are wide open. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day and trying to sort of explain sort of the Donald Trump phenomena to them, and that it was not actually sort of about Donald Trump. It was really about his followers. And I mean, to my mind, this struggle to get to that place where we first have to get rid of the idea of American exceptionalism, and then to really look at how our society was set up and sort of the it's not even the legacy costs essentially that we have in this country, and legacy burdens. It is, in my estimation, it is a zero-sum gain on some level, because the fact is that my dad, maybe to a certain extent, but certainly his dad, grew up in a world, even as, a Jew in the 1900s, early, not necessarily the greatest situation, but it certainly wasn't the worst. Grew up with this notion of like, my wife is my chattel. I am a white guy, so I'm here on the pecking order. I may be a Jew, but I'm not down here, or and I'm not that as that sort of like is passed on, right? I mean, he raises my dad raises me. There is embedded in there still some of those sort of sets of values, and you got people coming out saying that, it's not just a question of, okay, women are not your chattel anymore if you're a husband, and you're not automatically got the pole position because you're white. There's a loss of something there. I mean, it's not necessarily,
Right.
I mean, there's no justifying why it existed that way in the first place. But there is a loss. There is a built-in advantage that is gone and a presumption of where they are. And we're seeing that sort of play out, that sort of white-knuckled, I want to still hold on to this. They don't have the ability to say that. It comes out in this form of political correctness. Like, I don't want to be made uncomfortable at work because that black guy is dressed in the way that he feels comfortable. And it makes me feel uncomfortable because all of the norms that I know. And it's sort of saying, like, it's just reminding me that I don't have the pole position anymore.
Yeah, no, I think this is real. I mean, and Colbert just did on his late show, interviewed DeRay McKesson, and in a joke he said to DeRay as they switched seats, how can I check my white privilege? And DeRay asked him some question. He said, well, the one thing you can't do is take my money or take my show. Right? So you're not going to take my money and you're not going to take my show, right? And he was joking, but that's exactly the point, right? That's exactly the point you're making, because racial equality is viewed as a zero-sum game.
Right. There wouldn't be 7 or 8 white guys who all have a late-night show. There might be 2. And that means that the other 6 is going to be maybe a couple women, maybe a couple of black guys, maybe a couple of black women, or whomever. But it's just like, there's a value in being a white guy if that's the job you want.
Yeah, and so part of the challenge involves, right, making the argument, right, and let me say this, what we tend to do in the midst of that, and President Obama is a master of this, is equating white rage over the loss of privilege with black rage in the face of discrimination. Those two aren't the same thing. We want to be very, very clear about that. They aren't the same thing. But we want to respect what's happening, because what's going on here, not only do we see, Sam, not only do we see this zero-sum game thing working out with regards to black folk, but we also see what has been unleashed by an economic philosophy that has now made white workers vulnerable in ways that their whiteness don't protect them anymore. And I remember we just recently celebrated the 50th anniversary, or recognized the 50th anniversary of the debate between William F. Buckley and James Baldwin in Cambridge, right? And what was so fascinating about the debate is that there's this moment where Buckley says to Baldwin, I'm not concerned about black people voting in Mississippi. He says, I'm more concerned that too many people are voting in Mississippi.
Right.
That the conception of conservatism and the economic philosophy he had in mind, right, was just as vicious towards working class and working class white folk, right, was just as skeptical of the capacity, right, of working poor white people, right, and was unrelenting in how he imagined how this democracy should be, who should be the caretakers of this country, right? And what we have is an economic philosophy that is ruling today that is actually consonant with Buckley, right? And we see all of these vulnerable white folk out here, right, who's worried that they're losing the pole position because of demographic shifts, right? But who are also, right, watching their wages flatline. That's not because black folk are taking jobs.
Right.
Their wages have flatlined. Their homes aren't worth as much. That's not because black folk are suddenly owning more homes, right? That they don't see that their futures will be as bright for their children. And that's not because of, and this is what Bernie Sanders so powerfully, that's not because of undocumented workers. It's not because of black folk. But in the history of this country, whenever you see economic vulnerability, oftentimes the populism comes from the right, and it's so xenophobic, it scapegoats, and it always has attendant to it a kind of violence directed at those who are on the margins. And it becomes a way for those who actually control the wealth to consolidate power by exploiting those fears, right? By exploiting those fears. So on the one hand, you're right.
Well, those people are the short circuit, right? I mean, that's how we let the air out of the tires. We just sort of redirect and blame them. I mean, Flint could have happened in Appalachia, it seems to me, with white people, and it does. I mean, we see that playing out in terms of the coal mining there, and who's going to be drinking that coal sludge. It just so happens that in Michigan, if we got to cut money and we got to save money, we can do it on the backs of these people because they are at the end, the bottom of the bottom, and there's no blowback.
And in some ways, the hierarchy in the United States is one's proximity to that bottom.
Right.
So how close are you to those black folk? And how close are you to those red folk? And so, like you say, they can balance the budget on the backs of those who drink water in Flint. They can balance municipal budgets on the backs of school districts that service our children. That's all we need to do. 88 schools are closed in Detroit right now. Right, as teachers are striking, as Obama flies in, helicopters in to look at the auto show and meet with the folks are trying to show him what are 50 people, 50 kids in the class. You see the toilets, the state of the building, this is what our kids are experiencing in Detroit. Look at what happened in Chicago. Look what's happening in Philly, and we're not even talking about what's happening in the Delta of Mississippi, right, or the rural counties of Louisiana and Alabama, right. And so part of what we see here very clearly, right, is the very ways in which class and race interact in this country, and the way in which inequality is continuously reproduced because certain people, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, certain people are valued less. I said to a group of folk, when you go to the Canfield Apartments where Michael Brown was murdered or killed, or however you want to describe it, Sam, if it's a road in an apartment complex, and if you ever see those roads in apartment complexes, they're not that wide. And people's back doors are very close to that road. So you had a body with a bullet in the head for hours in a street in an apartment complex. 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds saw it. I mean, we think about that happening in Haiti. We think about it happening in the Congo. We don't think about that happening in the United States. That's a community terrorized and experiencing viscerally that they're not valued, And it's not that I'm trying to make the argument that white people should value black people more. No, that's not the claim. The claim is white people shouldn't be valued more. Right? Right? And I think this is at the heart of Black Lives Matter. We know we matter. That's not the point.
Right.
The point is that you don't matter more. And how do we organize a society that reflects that? How do we have economic arrangements that reflect the dignity and standing of every human being? How do we understand that we shouldn't be putting children in solitary confinement or in adult prisons? What do we make of the fact that we can't even get people a decent wage, $15, a decent wage, and they work hard? And people don't want to even give them a wage so they can pay rent and eat, right? There's something. I know I don't want to sound too polemical, but you see the point.
Yes, and it's. I wish we had more time, and I know that we will talk again, particularly after you're on a very well-deserved a big media tour right now. But let me and I again, I know that people are going to buy your book because we haven't even touched on this stuff. I sort of alluded to slightly just sort of the whole concept of misremembering MLK and how both Reagan did it and Clinton did it, and
right.
I would argue that Obama does it based
Sharpton
upon
does it,
and Sharpton does it. I mean, there is and I want to. There's a time, and maybe today's not. We don't have the time to go into this sort of. I know that you've written about. A black intellectual life, and I hope that we have time in the future to go in there. But let me ask you this, just simply because
sure.
it we are in the midst of this campaign, and there was an interesting piece by Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Right.
I guess it was just a blog post, but talking about Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders' perspective on reparations. And Bernie Sanders basically dismissed it as something that would not be viable. And Ta-Nehisi Coates responded with, well, yeah, but really, I mean, neither is single-payer health care at this point.
Right.
And I think that's, and I would even extend it in saying, like, nothing from a legislative perspective that we're going to hear from the Democrats is going to be viable, more than likely at the very least in this term. If something magical happens, maybe another 4 years out. But give me your perspective on that, because in some ways I found it a legitimate complaint. In some ways I found it a little bit curious because, it's not like there's other candidates out there willing to go out and say, yeah, I'm for reparations.
Right.
In the midst of a political campaign.
Yeah, I read the piece, and I think he was right to take Sanders on. I think it was interesting that at that moment Sanders became the pragmatic legislator. Mm-hmm. He sounded like a member of Congress at that moment, and when you listen to him under other circumstances, he certainly doesn't. He sounds like he wants to change the game as opposed to assent to the rules of the game. So I think Coates was absolutely right in taking him to task in this regard, in terms of his answer. But I think, unlike other politicians, I think there's room for Sanders to perhaps be convinced otherwise. And I would argue that Coates himself, right? Let's put it this way: I think Sanders' position can evolve if he's confronted with arguments like in some ways the argument that Coates puts forward, because Coates' own position evolved. He wrote an essay in 2010 entitled "Inverse Nationalism." Sam published it in the Atlantic, and he says, "I don't support reparations," in 2010. And we've never he's never provided an account of how his position has evolved from 2010 to the essay, The Case for Reparations. But the point is that positions evolve. And so I think given we want to be very careful in stoking opposition between class talk and race talk in this moment, right? Neither one is reducible to the other, but we need to understand that they're interacting constantly. And so part of what the argument has to be made to Sanders is why reparations is something that he needs to take much more seriously and be more thoughtful in his response to. And I think this becomes an occasion for that to happen. But I, like you, I found it curious that the essay was dropped at this moment. I mean, and then there's no account of his own evolution in terms of that position.
And there is, this has been an ongoing theme for Sanders in many respects. Is sort of is getting a more nuanced perspective on that sort of class versus race divide, to the extent that there is one. I mean and I should say, just even stepping back from that, like, it's pretty exciting that we could be having this type of criticism of a candidate who is, according to the polls, going to win the New Hampshire primary.
Exactly.
That's a pretty. We gotta take a moment to sit back and say, okay, we should appreciate this is the terrain that we are fighting on. But it has been his sort of central challenge, right? To sort of figure out how to talk both in terms of class and perceive these issues in the context of economics, but also one in terms of just sheer, I guess, sort of understanding of this sort of broader notion of a value gap.
Yep, and we saw his position evolve, right? I haven't come out and supported Sanders in any official way. I know one thing, and I can say this on your radio show, I hope, as I was watching the debate and listening to him talk about, this is no real substantive difference between us. This is just an example of campaign finance, of corporate money influencing politics, or Goldman Sachs and $600,000 a year. I was like, oh my God, what is this? I've never heard this kind of. Yeah. I've never heard anyone talk like that on this stage in my entire life, right? So I was kind of excited about it. I think he needs to work on his foreign policy issues. King Abdullah as a hero just kind of made me shudder. But I'm just excited. I was just excited to hear it. And so I say he's open to evolving, because you look at how he evolved on the Black Lives Matter issue. When those students interrupted him, his response then, and then how he sounds, what his policies are now, there are light years between those two moments. And so I think it's good for Coates to take him to account. I think if Coates is going to take him to an account, he needs to account for his own evolution on this position. But I think if any of those candidates can evolve, I think it's Bernie Sanders.
And I got to say, I mean, this is sort of outside of the purview here. But if we're going to get into a conversation about, if we're going to accept the idea that there is that nothing's going to happen legislatively, and so everybody should just let it all hang out, that critique, it seems to me, goes across the board. But I mean, if we're starting with the premise that everything is fantastical, then perhaps then it creates some real problems, I think, for Hillary Clinton, because she's running as the pragmatic doer, and that's tough to do if everybody's accepting the fact that nothing's going to get done. But
I think that's absolutely right, Sam. And I want to say this really quickly, and that is this: part of the political work that's happening in this moment is that there's an attempt to arrest our imaginations. God, Emerson says God speaks to us through our imaginations, and if that's true, then what's the devil doing? Right? The devil's trying to capture our imaginations. And so what's going on right now is that people are constantly telling us that our only options are those right in front of us. That's all we have. And if we believe that, then we're done. You might as well give up. You might as well raise the white flag. The first step in a revolution of value is to release our imagination from the chains of now, so that we can change our view of government, we can change our view of black people, which means we have to change our view of white people. And lastly, it will help us change what ultimately matters, where we can finally have a society that's not based upon greed, selfishness, narcissism, competition, rivalry, but rather where everyone will be accorded dignity and standing and can not only dream dreams, but make those dreams a reality. We need a revolution of the imagination in order to have a revolution of value.
Professor Eddie Glaude, the book is Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. Thank you so much for your time today. We left a lot on the table in terms of the book, not including the least of which your proposal in terms of voting. Yes, but we're going to have to do this again real soon. I always enjoy our talks very much.
I do too. I love it, man. And thank you so much for the work you guys are doing. And I really appreciate you.
All right. Well, good luck.